Unit 1, Knowing Who's Disabled. Welcome to Unit 1. This first unit helps us understand what disability means in schools under the Equality Act. It's where we need to start, because if we're not clear on who may count as disabled, we can't actually be confident we're meeting our duties as a school. We may not even realise when those duties apply. So in this session, we'll look at what counts as a disability under the Equality Act 2010. We'll also explore how to recognise disabilities that aren't always visible, and why it's so important to think about this early, before barriers build up. This unit is relevant for everyone who works in school, whether you're in the classroom, whether you're leading a subject, supporting pupils at lunchtime, or working one-to-one. Before we begin, take a pause for a moment and think about the pupils you work with. Are there any who might be facing barriers that haven't been named, or might not be recognised as a disability? That reflection is a really important starting point. So let's get started.
Okay, quick poll time. Nationally, what percentage of children do you think may count as disabled under the Equality Act? Have a look at the options on screen. Is it 5.3%, 7%, 9%, 11%, 12%, 14.2%, or 19.5%? Take a moment and decide which one you're going to go for. All right, let's see how you did. If you went for 12%, well done. That's the figure we're using today. It comes from the 2023 to 2024 Family Resources Survey, or FRS, which reports that around 12% of children are disabled using the Equality Act definition of disability. But if you picked another option, don't worry, those numbers aren't wrong. They reflect two things. First, how the Family Resources Survey figures have increased over time, and second, that this slide also includes the latest Special Educational Needs figures from the School Census in England, or SEN, so you may recognise some of those numbers too. Here's how the disability figures have changed over the years. Between 2012 and 2016, it was around 7%. In 2020 to 21, it was 9%, and then in 2021 to 22 and 22 to 23, it was 11%, and most recently 12% in the 2023 to 24 figures. For SEN data, which you'll probably be more familiar with, the latest school census shows that 5.3% of pupils have an education, health and care plan, 14.2% are receiving SEN support, and together that's 19.5% overall with SEN. So the point on this slide isn't that one figure is right and the others are wrong. They all come from real data sets, but they measure different things. The Family Resources Survey applies the Equality Act definition of disability. It gives us a picture of how many children in households count as disabled nationally. The School Census, on the other hand, records SEN under the Children and Families Act. That's what schools report, but it doesn't tell you who counts as disabled under the Equality Act. So the two overlap, but they're not the same, and that's why schools need to be mindful. A pupil may count as disabled under the Equality Act, even if they're not on your SEN register. Let's now look at the definition of disability. A person is disabled under the Equality Act if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Let's take a moment to break down the key terms that make up that legal definition of disability under the Equality Act. These three parts, substantial, long-term, and day-to-day activities, are what schools need to understand to recognise when a pupil may count as disabled in law. First, substantial. In everyday language, we often use this to mean something big or significant, like a substantial meal or a substantial problem. But under the Equality Act, substantial has a very specific meaning. It simply means more than minor or trivial. It means the effect of the impairment must be noticeable, must have some real impact, but it does not need to be severe, just not minor and not trivial. Second, long term. This means the adverse effect has lasted or is expected to last at least 12 months. So, for example, a short-term injury that heals in a few weeks, like a straightforward broken arm, probably would not meet this test. But a condition that is ongoing or likely to continue over time, like anxiety, asthma, or a chronic illness, could. And third, day-to-day activities. This refers to everyday things that a child would normally do, particularly in a school setting. So that includes things like reading, understanding instructions, communicating with others, moving around the school building, managing routines, or taking part in learning and social life. These are the kinds of daily activities that make up school life. So when we bring all three together, a substantial, long-term adverse effect on day-to-day activities, the definition is broader than many people assume. The threshold for meeting the test can be lower than people often expect, and it covers children with a wide range of physical or mental impairments, not just those with the most severe or visible difficulties. Now let's return to the very first part of the definition of disability. A person is disabled under the Equality Act if they have a physical or mental impairment. What do we mean by that? This is where the breadth of the definition really matters. It doesn't just mean mobility difficulties, although those are included. It can also include what we refer to as hidden impairments, such as autism, or specific learning difficulties like dyslexia or dyspraxia. It might include mental health conditions such as anxiety or depression, medical conditions such as epilepsy, diabetes, or severe asthma, speech, language, and communication impairments. But here's the key point. Having one of these conditions does not automatically mean a child is disabled under the Act. It will always depend on whether the impairment meets the test of being substantial and long-term in its effect on day-to-day activities. Some impairments may be visible, but many are hidden. A pupil may appear to be coping, yet still be experiencing barriers that put them at a disadvantage. If their impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their day-to-day life, they may well count as disabled under the Act. The scope of the definition is broad. This means it includes pupils who might otherwise be overlooked if schools hold too narrow a view of disability. For schools, this makes it especially important to understand and apply the definition carefully. In the event of a discrimination claim, it's the tribunal that ultimately decides whether a pupil meets the legal definition of disability. While a diagnosis may sometimes help the tribunal to understand the impairment, it is always the effect of the impairment on the child's daily life, not the label, that determines whether they are disabled under the law. This slide sets out some specific examples where the Equality Act provides automatic protection. What I mean by that is where a pupil is legally considered disabled without needing to show that the condition has a substantial and long-term adverse effect. We start with what the Act calls named conditions, and these are cancer, HIV, and multiple sclerosis. For these conditions, having the condition is enough for a pupil to be covered under the Equality Act, even if it's not currently affecting their day-to-day school life. This is usually established through a diagnosis, but the legal protection applies from the point the condition is identified or formally recognised. While we may rely on a diagnosis to understand a condition, or even that a child or a young person has a condition, a diagnosis is not needed for being covered by the definition. There is no need to show any current impact. The Equality Act treats the pupil as disabled based on the condition itself. There are several other important automatic inclusions. Severe disfigurements must be treated as having an adverse effect on day-to-day activities, even where a pupil is otherwise functioning well. The law recognises this disadvantage that this can cause. The Act also covers progressive conditions. These are conditions that are expected to get worse over time. These are treated as disabilities even before their effect becomes substantial, as long as they're likely to have that future impact. And pupils who are certified as blind or partially sighted are also considered disabled under the Act. The certification itself is what qualifies them. No further evidence of impact is needed. All of this shows us how broad and protective the Equality Act's definition of disability is, especially when it comes to pupils with serious, progressive, or misunderstood conditions. For schools, the key point is this. If you know a pupil has one of these conditions, whether it's through diagnosis, certification, or shared information, you should treat them as disabled under the Equality Act and plan accordingly. So as we looked at in the previous slides, Under the Equality Act, a person is disabled if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to do normal day-to-day activities. But when a child is under the age of 6, there's a really important point to understand. And this is where the Equality Act can be more protected than many people realise. It says that if a young child has an impairment that is likely to have a substantial adverse effect on their ability to do day-to-day activities once they are older, then they are considered disabled now. So this isn't just about what a child can or can't do today. It asks us to look ahead and think, is this impairment likely to create substantial difficulties in future once the child is over the age of 6? If the answer is yes, then the pupil is already protected under the Equality Act. Let's look at an example together. A 4-year-old has mild cerebral palsy. Right now, they may be walking and managing absolutely fine in the classroom, not needing much help or showing obvious signs of barriers. But think ahead to when they're 7 or 8. They might need to walk further, get changed for PE quickly, write more, or manage stairs and routines more independently. Those everyday activities could become significantly harder. So even though the effect isn't substantial yet, it's likely to be. And if that's likely, then the child meets the definition of disability now. This is where the anticipatory nature of the Equality Act really matters. The school can't wait until difficulties become visible. It must be proactive and start thinking about reasonable adjustments, thinking about removing barriers and avoiding discrimination, all before the child begins to struggle. The Equality Act regulations also set out a short list of specific exclusions. These are conditions which the law says are not to be treated as impairments. I'm including them here as background only because one of these exclusions is central to a case we're going to look at next. The exclusions are addiction to or dependency on alcohol, nicotine or any other substance other than in consequence of the substance being medically prescribed. Seasonal allergic rhinitis, for example hay fever, except where it aggravates the effect of another condition. A tendency to set fires, a tendency to steal, a tendency to physical or sexual abuse of other people, exhibitionism and voyeurism. Now let's look at how one of the exclusions we just covered in the last slide, a tendency to physical abuse, was tested in a real case. This case involved an 11-year-old pupil with autism, anxiety and pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. Over a period of 10 months, the pupil was given a series of suspensions for aggressive behaviour. The parents brought a disability discrimination claim to the first-tier tribunal. The tribunal ruled that the pupil was not protected under the Equality Act. Why? Because the behaviour was described as a tendency to physical abuse, and that's one of the conditions listed in the regulations as not to be regarded as an impairment. However, the decision was appealed, and the upper tribunal made a different ruling. They said, for children in education who have a recognised condition that is more likely to result in a tendency to physical abuse, the regulations do not remove the child from the definition of disability or from the protection that the Equality Act provides. So the exclusion does not apply to children in education in these circumstances. This doesn't mean that a school cannot exclude a disabled child, but it does mean that schools must comply with their duties under the Equality Act, anticipating and making reasonable adjustments, ensuring any decision is proportionate and justifiable, and not applying behaviour policies in a way that would disadvantage a disabled pupil.
Let's pause here for a moment and look at how disability, special educational needs or SEN, and medical conditions fit together. Under the Children and Families Act, the SEN framework applies where a pupil's learning difficulty or disability calls for special educational provision. The Equality Act, however, uses a different test. A pupil is protected as disabled under the Act if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Some medical conditions may fall within this definition. For example, epilepsy, diabetes, severe asthma or eczema. The key word here is may.
Not all medical conditions will amount to disability in law, but some clearly will. Schools also have a separate duty under the Children and Families Act to make arrangements to support pupils with medical conditions. That duty applies to maintained schools, academy schools, alternative provision academies and pupil referral units. We'll look at that duty in more detail elsewhere in the training, but it's helpful to see how these frameworks sit alongside one another. When we think about whether the effect is substantial, the Equality Act says we must assess it as if treatment or correction were not in place. So we have to ask ourselves, what would the impact be if the pupil did not have that treatment or correction? Things like medication, an inhaler, hearing aids or a glucose monitor. Take type 1 diabetes as an example. A pupil may appear to manage well day to day because they're taking insulin and having careful monitoring. But without that treatment, the condition would have a substantial adverse effect on things like eating, maintaining their energy levels, or concentrating in class. That means they would meet the Equality Act definition of disability. There's one important exception: glasses and contact lenses. For sight, we do take the correction into account. So if a pupil can see normally with glasses, they wouldn't usually meet the definition of disability on the basis of their sight. This example helps to show how the Equality Act, the SEN framework and the duties relating to medical conditions sit alongside one another, each with their own statutory basis and test. So a pupil may have SEN but not meet the Equality Act definition of disability. A pupil may meet the Equality Act definition of disability but not have SEN. And some pupils may fall within both frameworks. The important point for schools is to understand that these frameworks overlap but are not the same. Each carries its own duties and together they help ensure that pupils are protected and that schools remove barriers where they arise. Take a moment to think about the questions on the screen. Why is it essential for schools to understand who may count as disabled under the Act? Think about how that understanding shapes what schools do, the decisions they make, the reasonable adjustments that they might plan, and how early they're able to recognise barriers. What signs might suggest to you that a pupil could meet the legal definition of disability? Think about the things you notice day to day: patterns in attendance, participation, fatigue or concentration. These things might point to an underlying impairment. And how can your school gather appropriate information to consider whether a pupil is disabled under the Act? Reflect on how information moves across your school. What's picked up through observation? What's shared by families? And what might be hidden unless someone asks the right questions? You can pause the video here to think through these questions on your own, or have a talk about them with colleagues if you're watching as a team. And keep those reflections in mind because the next few slides take these ideas further. We'll look at why this understanding matters in practice and what it enables schools to do. It matters because schools have legal duties towards disabled pupils under the Equality Act, not to discriminate, to anticipate or plan ahead and make reasonable adjustments, and to make longer-term plans for inclusion and better outcomes, also known as the strategic duties. And those duties only work in practice if schools know who their disabled pupils may be. But, key point here, there is no duty on parents or pupils themselves to disclose a disability. So that's why it's really important that schools ask the right questions, keep an open mind and look beyond formal diagnoses. So how do schools build a picture? Well, the duty applies when a school knows or could reasonably be expected to know that a pupil is disabled. In law, this includes anything the school is told, observes, or can reasonably be expected to find out. So let's look at common ways schools can understand who may count as disabled. On this slide, we see some of the ways schools may come to understand that a pupil is disabled. It often starts with something small, something noticed, shared, or picked up along the way. You might see a new starter form that mentions a learning difficulty or a disability or a health condition, and that can give the school an early indication that reasonable adjustments might be needed. It might also come through a conversation with a parent or from something a pupil chooses to share with a trusted adult in school. It's these informal conversations that are often where important information comes to light. Observations by staff can also be a trigger. They may notice that a pupil is finding it hard to keep up in PE because of stamina, or they may see signs of anxiety in lessons, or a pupil struggling with organisation and focus. And it's not just teachers. Any member of staff, from lunchtime supervisors to admin teams, they may notice these things. Patterns in school records are another clue. Repeated health-related absences, a run of short suspensions, or dips in attainment in particular subjects. On their own, these don't necessarily indicate a disability, but together they can highlight where barriers may exist. And that's why it's helpful for schools to join up and record what they know. Small pieces of information, when connected, can reveal a much bigger picture about the barriers a pupil is facing. And here's a really important point to remember. Schools must not wait to be told. The duty applies where they know, or could reasonably be expected to know, that a pupil is disabled. And in practice, this means anticipating and acting early. Schools can't wait for a diagnosis or for a parent to raise something. It's about professional curiosity, the same principle you'll recognise from safeguarding. It means being alert to what you see and hear, connecting small pieces of information and following them up sensitively. And understanding barriers early helps us make sure that no pupil is overlooked. Of course, spotting the signs is only part of it. What matters next is how schools respond. First, it's about keeping information joined up, especially at points of transition. When a pupil moves to a new school or setting, important details can be lost. If records aren't passed on clearly, pupils risk starting without the reasonable adjustments that they need. That's why consistent systems for collecting and sharing information are so important. It helps prevent delay and means pupils are supported from day one. Regular check-ins with parents and pupils are another key part. Impairments can change, emerge, or fluctuate. A health condition might become more complex, or expectations may rise as a pupil moves through the year groups. What felt manageable in year 2 might feel very different by year 6. Regular conversations mean schools can review and adapt adjustments as circumstances change. And when we talk about conversations, the focus should always be on barriers and reasonable adjustments. Some families may not use the word disabled, even when the Equality Act definition is met, or may feel unsure what information to share. That's why open questions are so useful. Things like, is there anything that would make things easier for your child? It helps build trust and shows that the school is ready to listen and act. Finally, remember that the duty is anticipatory and ongoing. It isn't something schools do once and then tick off. It's a continuous responsibility that helps schools stay ahead of barriers and make sure all pupils can participate fully. And this brings us to another part of the picture, because schools can only act on what they know. Understanding the context for disclosure is an important part of applying these duties well. There are many reasons why information about an impairment may not be shared straight away. Some families simply don't use the word disabled. It may not be how they see their child or how they choose to describe them. They may talk instead about a health condition, a difficulty, or say their child just needs a little bit of extra help. Others may not realise that their child is covered by the definition in the Act, especially where no one has possibly explained how broad that definition is. Some families worry about how information might be received or used. They may fear that their child will be treated differently. For example, discouraged from applying or quietly told that another school might be a better fit. And in some cases, the culture of the school can unintentionally reinforce those worries. If reasonable adjustments are only discussed for pupils already on the SEN register, or if staff don't ask open questions about what would help, families might assume that sharing more information won't change anything, or could even make things harder for them. Look at the red box on this slide. The Act is clear. Legal duties apply if the school knows or could reasonably be expected to know that a pupil is disabled. There is no duty on parents to disclose. The responsibility rests with the school. It's not for the school to decide whether an impairment meets the legal definition of disability. That decision rests with the tribunal if a discrimination claim is made. But the duty to act, to avoid discrimination and to make reasonable adjustments, begins as soon as the school is deemed to know about the impairment. If a parent shares information with any member of staff, even informally, such as with a lunchtime supervisor, the school is then deemed to know. The only defence in law is if the school could not reasonably have been expected to know. And that's why it's so important that all staff understand what to do when information is shared and who to pass it on to. Let's think about what families actually see and hear, because even small things in how we communicate can send powerful signals. Christine Rose, an expert in disability disclosure and confidentiality, highlights that the question, "Do you have a disability? Yes or no?" is commonly used, but that doesn't make it effective. She encourages providers to move away from blunt binary questions like that. Instead, she recommends more thoughtful, inclusive ways to ask, ones that focus on adjustments and support, not labels. For example, would you like to discuss any adjustments or support that might help your child? Is there anything we should be aware of that could affect your child's learning or their experience in school? This is part of what Christine Rose calls creating a safe and supportive environment, one where families feel confident to share information because they trust it will lead to help, not harm. And that's the key point for schools. Whether it's forms, welcome meetings, or everyday conversations, we need to think about how our language, our layout and tone shape the messages families receive. If all we ask is, "Do you have a disability, yes or no?" some families will simply tick no, even if their child meets the legal definition, because they don't connect with the label. But if we shift the focus to support and inclusion, families are much more likely to share the information schools need in order to meet their legal duties. This links directly to the next slide, which looks at real experiences from families gathered by the Office of the Children's Commissioner. We're going to look at what the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England found in their investigation into school admissions. The report was called "It Might Be Best If You Looked Elsewhere," and it captured real experiences of families of disabled children. These quotes on the slide are taken directly from the research. One parent recalled being told, "He wouldn't be able to cope, he would struggle. It might be best if he didn't come here." Another described being told quietly, "Between you and me, this isn't the best place for your child. They need somewhere smaller. This is an enormous school." These comments may not sound like outright refusals, but the message received by families is clear. You're not wanted here. Parents may be discouraged from disclosing a disability if they think the information will be used against their child. For some families, they've already heard messages like this in other schools or in other parts of the system. The key point for us is that this kind of messaging may amount to discrimination. It discourages families from applying and it undermines trust. And it shows why tone and culture matter so much. If parents have been given messages like this elsewhere, they may be much less likely to disclose in your school, even if your intentions are positive. That's why schools need to focus on creating an environment where families feel confident disclosure will lead to inclusion and support, not discouragement. You've just seen how subtle messages like those from the Children's Commissioner report can shape whether families feel welcome or shut out. Now let's look at how that same pattern can play out once a pupil is already in school. This next example is a real-life tribunal case. Child P was a Year 11 pupil described by his school as having persistent low-level disruption and difficulties following instructions. The school knew of his special educational needs and had documented challenges, but they didn't consider whether he might meet the legal definition of disability under the Act. He received 4 fixed-term exclusions in 1 year. Staff described him as just a mainstream kid and said they thought they were treating him like everyone else. That, they thought, was fair. But the tribunal looked at this differently. and it's really important we understand why. Have a guess. What do you think the tribunal may have decided, and why? You may have already guessed where this is heading. Let's look now at what the tribunal actually found and why this case matters for every school. School's view. Staff saw Child P as a mainstream kid. They viewed his behaviour as disruptive and believed he needed firmer discipline. They felt that treating him the same as everyone else was fair, and that applying the school's behaviour policy consistently was the right approach. They acknowledged that he had special educational needs, but they didn't consider him to be disabled under the Act. They assumed SEN and disability were separate categories and didn't link his difficulties with the broader legal definition of disability. When he received repeated fixed-term exclusions, they justified these on the grounds of cumulative incidents and felt their response was proportionate within school policy. But the tribunal reached a very different conclusion, and this highlights why understanding the duties in the Act is so important for all staff. First, the tribunal found that Child P did meet the definition of disability. He had a combination of impairments: learning, social and emotional, communication and organisational, and together they had a substantial and long-term adverse effect on his ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Second, because the school was aware of these impairments, including through its own SEN records, the tribunal concluded that the school was deemed to know he was disabled. Under the Act, a school cannot use lack of awareness as a defence if it could reasonably have been expected to know. Third, the tribunal found that the behaviour leading to the exclusions arose in consequence of his impairments, and that the school had failed to make reasonable adjustments to avoid the disadvantage he experienced. The school had applied its behaviour policy as a blanket approach without adjustment, and this amounted to discrimination arising from disability. The tribunal also found that the school failed to follow statutory guidance, specifically the Department for Education's guidance on suspensions and exclusions, which requires schools to consider whether behaviour may be linked to a disability and whether reasonable adjustments should be made to avoid exclusion. And finally, the tribunal addressed a common misunderstanding that treating all pupils the same is automatically fair. They stated very clearly that this belief can itself result in discrimination, because disabled pupils may need a different, more proportionate response. The tribunal's written judgment went further, setting out exactly why the school's approach amounted to discrimination. Let's look at those words directly. The tribunal's final ruling in Child P's case included 3 powerful statements, and they don't just summarise the judgment, they go right to the heart of what schools need to understand about the Equality Act and disability. First, the tribunal said, "It is no answer to a claim of discrimination under Section 15 or Section 20 to say, we treat all pupils the same. Far from providing a defence, it will often amount to an admission." This tackles a common misunderstanding. For most protected characteristics, equality is about treating people the same, but disability is different. The Equality Act recognises that disabled pupils may need different, even more favourable, treatment to avoid disadvantage. So when a school says, we apply the rules to everyone equally, that can actually be evidence that the school has not considered whether any reasonable adjustments were required, and under the Equality Act, that may amount to discrimination. The second quote comes directly from the tribunal's reasoning. To treat everyone the same, to apply the school's rules and procedures on behaviour management regardless of disability, is to discriminate against a pupil whose disabilities call for a proportionate response or adjustments to be made. Child P's behaviour was shaped by the impact of his impairments, including communication and emotional regulation difficulties. But the school used a blanket behaviour policy. They didn't stop to ask, what would a proportionate response look like here? What adjustments could we make? And this is where Section 15, discrimination arising from disability, and Section 20, the duty to make reasonable adjustments, both come into play. It's not enough to say the rules were followed. The law requires schools to think ahead and adapt. And the third quote concludes the judgment. This was a serious case of disability discrimination, both in terms of the impact on Child P and because it arose from a systemic disregard of the needs of disabled pupils. The tribunal was clear. This wasn't an isolated slip. It was a wider failure to recognise who may count as disabled under the Act and to take action. Child P lost 30 school days during his GCSE year to exclusion, and no reasonable adjustments were made. Staff recognised his special educational needs, but no one joined the dots. The school applied the rules regardless of disability, and that then led to discrimination. At the heart of the Equality Act's approach to disability is the need for a proactive and thoughtful response. Inclusion doesn't mean treating all pupils the same. It means removing barriers, which may involve doing things differently or treating disabled pupils more favourably. The duty to make reasonable adjustments is anticipatory. Schools are expected to plan ahead and adapt their policies and practices. If a pupil's behaviour arises from their disability and no adjustments are made, this can amount to unlawful discrimination with serious consequences for the pupil. Let's end this unit with a few key takeaways. The definition of disability under the Equality Act is broad. It covers more children and young people than many might initially imagine. When considering whether a pupil is disabled, it's the effect of the impairment that matters, not the diagnosis. There is a significant overlap between disability, SEN and medical conditions. Many pupils with SEN or with medical needs will also be considered disabled under the Act, but not all. And some disabled pupils won't be identified as having SEN at all. There is no duty on parents or pupils to disclose a disability, so schools cannot rely on disclosure to meet their duties. The expectation is that schools take a proactive approach using available information, including observation of progress and behaviour, to consider whether a pupil might be disabled and whether adjustments might be needed. If a parent or carer shares information with any member of staff, even informally, including a member of the office team, the school is then deemed to know. In the event of a discrimination claim, it is no defence for the school to say it didn't know the pupil was disabled, unless it can show that it couldn't reasonably have been expected to know. That sets a clear legal threshold. And finally, it's not up to the school to decide whether a pupil is disabled under the Act. That decision rests with the tribunal if a claim is made. Let's finish this unit with a short activity that brings everything together and helps us think about pupils we may not have thought of before as disabled. Start by looking at the purple box on the left. These are patterns you might recognise in pupils you work with. A pupil who finds it hard to concentrate for long periods, gets overwhelmed by noise or busy spaces, is often exhausted or anxious, finds written tasks especially hard, or avoids certain lessons or areas of school. You may already have pupils in mind who fit some of these descriptions. The question is, could some of them meet the legal definition of disability, even if no one has used that word? Now look at the blue box on the right. The Equality Act protects pupils who experience a long-term, 12 months or more, and substantial, more than minor or trivial, impact on everyday school life, even if there's no diagnosis. That means the group of pupils protected under the Act is often wider than we might think. So as you think about those pupils, use the two prompts on the slide. What kind of information would help you understand whether a pupil might meet this definition of disability? What kind of adjustments could help remove barriers in your classroom, your routines, or your wider school environment? Now that you've got that context, pause the video and take a few minutes to reflect. You might jot down your thoughts or talk them through with a colleague or your team. When you're ready, press play again and we'll think about what you could do with the reflections that you've made. You may have noted one or two pupils. The next step is to consider how that information can be used within your school. If you're a teacher or classroom-based member of staff, that might mean sharing your observations with your Senko or your line manager so they can be joined up with other information. If you're a senior leader, you might look for patterns across pupils or settings that suggest wider barriers in routines, spaces or policies.
Noticing and sharing what you see helps school anticipate disadvantage before it happens. And that's how schools meet their duties under the Act, by acting on what they know, removing barriers and preventing discrimination. Now look at the yellow box at the bottom of the slide. It's a reminder that you're not being asked to diagnose. That isn't your role. Under the Act, the duty to make reasonable adjustments is anticipatory and ongoing. Schools must think ahead about what disabled pupils might require, act on what they know, and review and adapt as circumstances change. Your role is to notice patterns, ask respectful questions, and share information so that the school can act on it. That's what helps prevent discrimination, because it means the school is anticipating barriers and planning adjustments before pupils are put at a disadvantage.
You've reached the end of this unit. Thank you for taking the time. Understanding these duties under the Equality Act is an important step in making sure disabled pupils are not at a disadvantage in school. So before you move on, take a few minutes to complete the takeaway activity. It's there to help you think through what this means in your role and what might need to change in the way that things are done. When schools get this right for disabled pupils, it often leads to stronger, more inclusive practice for everyone. Thank you once again. Goodbye.
The Council for Disabled Children has produced a family of Equality Act guides that underpin this training. They're grounded in legislation and statutory guidance and provide explanations, examples and practical tools for schools and settings. The Teacher's Guide focuses on what school staff need to know and do in day-to-day practice. The Guide for Governors and Trustees sets out the strategic responsibilities of the governing body or academy trust, whoever the responsible body is under the Act, and includes helpful checkpoints for review and accountability.